All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're diving deep into the world of Indian politics. And it can get a little crazy sometimes.
It sure can.
We're focusing specifically on the anti-defection law.
Yeah.
Now, whether you're a UPSC aspirant aiming for a spot in the civil services, or just someone who, you know, wants to understand how Indian democracy works,
Right.
this deep dive is for you. Indian politics, well, it's known for its vibrancy and its energy, but let's face it, it can be pretty messy at times.
Definitely.
You got politicians switching parties, alliances breaking down. It's enough to make your head spin.
You said it.
And that is exactly where the anti-defection law comes into play. This law is enshrined in the 10th schedule of the Indian Constitution, and it's all about keeping things stable in the middle of all the chaos.
That's a good way to put it. And knowing this law inside and out is super important, especially if you're thinking about taking those UPSC exams.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a hot topic for the examiners because it really gets to the heart of how our political system works,
For sure. So let's go back in time a bit to 1985 when this law was first introduced. What was going on in Indian politics back then that made this anti-defection law so necessary?
Well, picture this. The Indian Parliament, a place for passionate debate and where the will of the people is supposed to be represented.
Right.
But back in the 60s and 70s, things were a bit different. It was like a political circus with politicians switching sides all the time, like a game of musical chairs.
Oh, wow.
A lot of it was driven by personal gain or pressure from other political forces.
Well, I see.
It was called horse trading, and basically it was chipping away at the public's trust and turning democracy into a bit of a joke.
So politicians were basically treating political parties like revolving doors,
Yes.
going in and out as they pleased.
Exactly.
No wonder they needed a law to try and put a stop to that. But how exactly does this law define defection? What actions would actually get a member of parliament or a state legislature disqualified?
Well, the law is pretty specific on that. Let's say you're an elected representative. If you decide to just up and leave your party, maybe to join a different one or to become independent, that's considered defection.
Makes sense.
And similarly, if your party tells you to vote a certain way, like they whip you, and you decide to go against their instructions or just don't vote at all, well, that can get you disqualified too.
Oh, wow.
It's all about maintaining party discipline and making sure you're acting in line with your party's stance, which ideally is supposed to reflect what the voters who elected you want.
So it sounds like this law is trying to find a balance between individual freedom and the responsibility you have to your party. But wouldn't these super strict rules end up stifling any dissent within parties? What if a politician genuinely disagrees with their party on something?
You've hit on a really important point, and it's something that comes up a lot when people talk about this law. It's a tricky situation, right? The law is trying to prevent politicians from jumping ship for the wrong reasons, but it does kind of walk a fine line when it comes to individual conscience and the freedom to have different views. It's something to really think about, especially if you're preparing for those UPSC essays where you might be asked to analyze how this law affects the whole democratic process.
Yeah, you've really hit on one of the most controversial parts of the anti-defection law.
Okay.
It's that constant tug of war between keeping the party together and still letting people speak their minds.
I see.
Think about it. If a politician is worried about getting kicked out for saying what they really think, how can they actually represent the people who voted for them?
Right.
So it raises some serious questions about whether the law is actually preventing real democratic debate from happening.
Yeah, it almost sounds like a catch-22.
Kind of, yeah.
We want to stop politicians from just acting in their own self-interest, but we also don't want them just blindly following orders from the party.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you bring in the presiding officer.
You know, the Speaker of the Lok Sabha or the chairperson of the Rajya Sabha.
Right.
They're the ones who get to decide if a member has defected or not, and their decision is a pretty big deal.
It's a lot of power. So let's say you're a politician and you've gone against your party's whip.
Okay.
Maybe you really believe you're doing what's best for your constituents.
Right.
But now your fate is in the hands of the presiding officer. But wait, there's a twist, right?
There is.
The presiding officer is also a member of a political party.
Right.
So there's always a chance they could be biased.
Exactly. And while the law says that the presiding officer has to be impartial, let's be real, they're human, and politics is a pretty intense world.
Absolutely.
This whole issue of potential bias was actually at the center of a very important case.
Oh, really?
The Quijano-Holohan case back in 1993.
Okay.
The Supreme Court decided that while the anti-defection law was generally valid, The presiding officer's decision wasn't the final word.
So there's a way to challenge it.
You got it.
That makes me feel a little better. But even with that check on their power, the big question remains, does this law actually work?
Yeah.
I mean, does it really stop unethical behavior and create more stability? Or does it just give even more power to party leaders?
Now, that's where the debate gets really heated, especially if you're thinking about the UPSC exam.
Right.
The anti-defection law really makes us think hard about power and representation in a democracy.
For sure.
On one side of the argument, you could say that by making parties stronger, the law makes it harder for individual politicians to just switch sides for their own benefit.
Okay.
This should theoretically lead to governments that are more stable, which can be a good thing for getting policies made and making progress.
Right.
But there's always another side to the story, isn't there?
Always.
Critics say that all this party control actually ends up silencing any debate or disagreement within the party.
I could see that happening.
Imagine a scenario where a party leader is doing something shady. If party members are afraid of being disqualified, they might not speak up even if they know it's wrong.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good.
Right. And they argue that this concentration of power actually goes against what a real democracy is all about.
So we're trying to walk this tightrope between keeping things in order and making sure democracy isn't being compromised.
That's it, exactly.
And it's not just about the politicians themselves, is it? This law also affects the relationship between the voters and the people they elect.
That's a great point. When you vote, are you choosing a specific person to represent you, or are you basically voting for a party and their whole agenda? And this gets even more complex in India, where personal connections and local issues often play a big role in who people vote for.
Absolutely.
So the anti-defection law adds another layer to this whole thing and makes us wonder who really has the power.
Yeah.
Is it the individual politician, the party? Or in the end, is it the voters?
It's a fascinating question, especially for people who want to be civil servants, who'll be the ones making sure our democracy runs smoothly.
That's right.
Understanding these nuances of the anti-defection law isn't just about memorizing stuff for the UPSC exam.
Right.
It's about really getting to grips with how our political system works, all the little details of it.
And that's exactly why this topic shows up so often on those exams.
Okay.
They want to see if you can go beyond just scratching the surface. You know, analyze different viewpoints and form your own opinions based on what you've learned.
So it's not about getting the right or wrong answer. It's about showing that you can think for yourself and really engage with these complicated issues. So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, let's keep those questions in mind. Does the anti-defection law actually do what it's supposed to?
Yeah.
How do we find the right balance between party discipline and individual freedom?
Right.
And maybe the most important question of all, what role should individual conscience have in a representative democracy? As we wrap up our deep dive into the anti-defection law, I'm really struck by how complex this whole thing is.
Yeah, it really is.
It's like, when you peel back the layers of an onion, each layer you uncover just brings up even more questions.
I like that analogy. It fits
Yeah.
perfectly. The anti-defection law is definitely not simple. It shows how Indian democracy is constantly evolving, trying to find a balance between different ideas that each have their pros and cons.
And for anyone listening who's getting ready for the UPSC exam, this law is full of potential essay topics.
Oh, for sure.
It touches on so many important themes.
Mm-hmm.
How representation works,
Yeah.
the balance of power, the role of individual conscience in a democracy.
It's all there.
And remember, the examiners aren't looking for you to just memorize a bunch of facts.
No, they want more than that.
They want to see that you can analyze a complicated issue like this from all angles, understand its history, and form your own opinions about it all based on what you've learned.
Exactly.
So let's go over some of the key things we've talked about today. First, we looked at the historical background of the anti-defection law. We saw how back in the 60s and 70s, all that horse trading that was going on really created a need for stability and accountability in politics.
Yeah, things are getting out of hand.
And then we dug into how the law actually works, how it defines defection, and what the consequences are for politicians who break the rules.
Right. And we didn't shy away from the controversial parts either.
And really not.
We tackled those concerns head on, about how it might stifle dissent, give too much power to party leaders, and even change how representation works.
We also spent some time talking about the role of the presiding officer, how much power they have in deciding these defection cases, and the possibility of bias, even with the option of judicial review.
Right. All important points.
And maybe most importantly, we highlighted what the anti-defection law means for Indian democracy as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
It really makes us think about the relationship between voters, their elected representatives, and the